Roguelikes are fun. Like, really fun. It's a genre about chasing that one god run, that one dopamine hit, that one more run. But, what are roguelikes? For those who didn't really understand what any of that meant, let's look at the Wikipedia definition of what a roguelike is. A roguelike is a style of role-playing game traditionally characterized by a dungeon crawl through procedurally generated levels, turn-based gameplay, grid-based movement, and permadeath of the player character. Now, for seasoned gamers, this doesn't really check out because most of the most popular roguelikes nowadays aren't really like that. While The Binding of Isaac can be considered as a dungeon crawler, it's not really a turn-based RPG. And Risk-Ring 2 does have a permadeath system, but it doesn't really have a grid-based movement system. It's a third-person shooter. And because these games didn't really have the checkboxes checked when it comes to the traditional definition of what a roguelike is, people have now categorized these games as roguelites, a lighter version of a roguelike. And thus, a roguelike subgenre has been born. The roguelite subgenre. And as years go by, more and more roguelike and roguelite subgenres emerged. There are now card-based roguelites that use deck-building mechanics instead of action combat like Slay the Spire and Balatro. There are also now roguelikes that focus more on story like Hades and Inscription, where the roguelike elements were used more to tell the story than to be the game itself. Heck, there are even games that aren't really known as roguelites that are debated if they really are roguelikes or not, like Phasmophobia or Don't Starve. And finally, one of the newer ones, and the topic of the day, the quote-unquote Vampire Survivor clones. The arena-type roguelite subgenre. What's Vampire Survivors, some of you might ask? Well, this is Vampire Survivors. In December 2021, an indie game called Vampire Survivors blew up on Steam. It's a 2D roguelite where you are the bullet hell. You roam around an arena to kill monsters, get upgrades, evolve your weapons to kill even more monsters. You also have to survive a certain amount of time, in this case 30 minutes, while defending against hordes of monsters and demons. Now, the concept of this game and even the graphics might look extremely simple. My dad once saw me playing this game during vacation and he said that I should stop playing this Game Boy game and, play God of War instead or something. But I tell you, like I told him, that this game is freaking fun. Over 200,000 people think the same. But when something is popular, some will eventually follow in its footsteps. And in this case, they follow really closely. This game spawned a lot of games that are very similar to its game mechanics. Games where you roam around in an arena, kill monsters, get upgrades to kill even more monsters, and you have to survive a certain amount of time to win. Now, this is just straight up copying, isn't it? It's a clear-cut example of plagiarism. Well, I kinda disagree. I would say that some of the games that are marked as Vampire Survivor clones don't deserve that title at all. Because I think that game mechanics should never be monopolized by one game alone. Now, what do I mean by this? In September 2020, Genshin Impact converted normies into weebs faster than the whole anime industry could in 2 decades. In not even a month, you have thousands of people spending millions on anime waifus, or in this case, an alcoholic bard and child's instruction to carpet bombing. Now, even though Genshin Impact is still relevant to this day and it's kind of the center of hundreds of drama at this point, the vast majority of people and players have probably already forgotten about this one particular drama involving The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Almost immediately after Genshin's launch, people are already talking. Genshin looks awfully similar to Breath of the Wild, doesn't it? Like, both of them are open world RPGs where you can climb, glide, and run around an open world, eliminating camps of enemies, entering dungeons that look fairly similar to each other. There's also the feature of having elemental reactions and all of these environmental effects interacting with one another. Both games also sound and look similar, so isn't Genshin just blatantly copying Zelda at this point? Well, as a person who has played both games, I can safely say that these two games are completely different from each other. It's so different that I think it's comparable to saying that Breath of the Wild is copying Skyrim. It's that different. Because aside from borrowing some game mechanics like gliding, climbing, and even elemental reactions that, the game obviously takes inspiration from Breath of the Wild, it's two completely different experiences. And I also don't think that it's weird that two games from the same genre, an open world RPG, would, have the same game mechanics that work with these two games. For those who are still not convinced, I will justify plenty of points regarding this, and I promise you that this is still a video about Vampire Survivor clones. I promise you it'll be relevant later. Now, there are 3 main arguments to this plagiarism take. The first one is that these two games look very similar to each other, and in some cases, they sound similar to each other. The second one is that the enemy and dungeon designs look very similar to each other as well. And the third one is that Genshin borrows game mechanics from Breath of the Wild. Now, let's discuss the first 2 points first, because the third one is obviously the most important one. Now, for the first one, they look and sound very similar to each other. Now, I'm not the first person to say this, but taking inspiration from another game to make your own art form isn't really a bad thing. And sometimes, it's a good thing, especially when it comes to art styles. If you are saying that Genshin Impact is a carbon copy of Breath of the Wild's cel-shaded design, then Breath of the Wild's art style is just copied from Jet Set's Radio's art style as well, since they're both cel-shaded. You have to remember that when it comes to this cel-shaded art style, Breath of the Wild didn't really invent this. Think about it. When it comes to games of a fantasy art style that's also cel-shaded, you have the Atelier game series, or how about the Dragon Quest series? These 2 series have been spanning for years already, and they also use the cel-shaded look. This type of art style has been a long-standing thing when it comes to anime games in general. Even the Persona series, Persona 5 and Persona 3, use this cel-shaded art style. So yeah, I don't really get this point. It's like saying all 2D turn-based RPGs are the same because, they're all 2D sprites and they all look similar from each other, especially from that time. So yeah, let's put that point at rest. Now let's go to the second point, which is that the enemy and dungeon designs look similar to each other. And well, it's kind of the same point. as the first one. The Hilichurls and their camps are indeed inspired by Zelda's Bokoblins and Bokoblin camps, but the thing is, these two things are also very much inspired by any primitive are very much inspired by any primitive fantasy enemy. Like, think goblins and orcs. Like, these are very common medieval fantasy game enemies, and they're very similar to Hilichurls and Bokoblins and the camps that they make, because again, they're almost tropey in a way. Like, even think of the Neckers from the Witcher series. They are very similar when it comes to design-wise, and they're, Okay, never mind. That it's kind of a stretch, but I think you get my point. When it comes to these enemy types, they're very much just inspired by goblins, really. And as for the dungeon designs, I think that there is a valid point to be had here, but I think it's more on because the dungeons of Breath of the Wild and Genshin Impact had the same purpose. In Genshin Impact, the dungeons were made to teach the player how the elements were used and how to use them correctly. And in Breath of the Wild, most of the dungeons are also there to teach the player how to use their gadgets efficiently, and even in creative situations. But I think this is not really copying from each other and just how tutorial dungeons work. And I'm pretty sure that tutorial dungeons have just been a staple to any not Final Fantasy, god damn it, to any fantasy genre game out there. Now, let's be honest, those are the baby points. Those are the arguments that are just surface level at most, so it was very quick to shoot them down. How about the biggest point, which is the game mechanics? Genshin Impact has gliding, climbing, and elemental reactions that are, game mechanics from Breath of the Wild. And I am pretty certain that Breath of the Wild did play a big factor in putting these game mechanics to Genshin Impact. And I say that that's fine. Game mechanics have been passed down from game to game for years now, and I think that's a good thing. For example, procedural generation in games has existed since Rogue back in the 1980s, and games like Minecraft and No Man's Sky still use it to this day. I mean, think about it. Breath of the Wild in itself has obvious inspirations from Assassin's Creed, Just Cause even, and even the Elder Scrolls series. A lot of Breath of the Wild's climbing mechanics, you can very much see it in Assassin's Creed, like any Assassin's Creed game. Well, how about the paragliding mechanic that looks like it's trademarked by Breath of the Wild at this point, where in any game that has paragliding, it's immediately a copy of Breath of the Wild? Well, Just Cause 3 has had paragliding since 2016. So, did Breath of the Wild scam these games, take their game mechanics for itself? No. It's just that these game mechanics has suited open world games for years now. I'm just saying that when it comes to these game mechanics, if it makes the game more fun, add it. Because that's just better for the game itself, and it's better for us gamers. We get to enjoy these game mechanics in open world games. Instead of feeling restricted and not being able to climb that wall, well, now we can climb it. And the thing is, when you put aside the game mechanics that Genshin borrowed from Breath of the Wild, what do you have? You have a very rich world with its own lore. As you can see here, the environments change so much from one place to another. You have a lot of characters that have their own stories that you can explore at your own pace. You have an elemental reaction-based combat system, because I don't really think it borrowed this from Breath of the Wild itself. It made it its own. And a story that actually gets better over time. Like Fontaine itself can never be compared to Breath of the Wild anymore. It can never be seen as a Breath of the Wild clone anymore. So, as you can see, it doesn't just borrow game mechanics and yoink it from Breath of the Wild. It added a lot of twists. it made it its own thing and has its own experience now. Even Breath of the Wild could never replicate what Genshin has now. And, vice versa. I think that the borrowing of game mechanics is only really bad when the game provides the same exact experience as the game it borrowed it from. Like, to a T. I can probably illustrate this point better by using a game that has so many examples of just blatant copying, as well as a lot of games that are just inspired by it and borrows a lot of game mechanics from it. Minecraft. Now, Minecraft has a lot of just blatant copies of itself, and that's because of its popularity. And not just popularity, it's because of how easy it is to make a Minecraft-like game. Block World and Blockcraft 3D, these two games are basically copies of Minecraft, except, they have microtransactions instead. I swear, it's a downgrade of Minecraft at that. These games took the main mechanic of Minecraft, which is mining, crafting, and having this large sandbox world where you can build, you can craft, you can explore, you can mine, and do all of these wonderful things. And all these games did, like these two games in particular, was take that, put it in a different game, and put a different title to it. And then you have inspired games that took the crafting and exploring part of Minecraft and even the blocky textures and made it its own. I remember when Terraria first popped into the scene and everybody was calling it a Minecraft clone, and that was just insane. One was an open world voxel type exploration sandbox game, and another one is a sandbox boss rush game. These are completely different games. And I feel like you're getting very tired of me saying that phrase, I swear. But yeah, that Terraria is what I meant by borrowing game mechanics from Minecraft and making it its own. That's why you can see it right now, and nobody makes the statement that Terraria is a clone of Minecraft anymore, because it has already established this image as its own thing. And the funny thing is, Genshin has done the same now. I don't think there's anyone who would ever say that Genshin is a copy of Breath of the Wild anymore. Especially with Fontaine's release. Just look at the difference, and I think it speaks for itself. So how the heck does all of this relate back to Vampire Survivors? And, in particular, Vampire Survivor clones. I think it's pretty obvious, but let's get into it. Think of Vampire Survivors as Minecraft and Breath of the Wild, and Vampire Survivor-like games as Genshin Impact, Terraria, and any other open-world game that has been touched by gliding as a mechanic. I think that the games that spawn from Vampire Survivors aren't all soulless crash grabs that people seem to think of. Of course, there will always be soulless cash grabs out there that would only see the success of Vampire Survivors as a way to capitalize on it. But that's true for every subgenre and genre out there, like the Minecraft clones as we've discussed earlier. There are games like Brotato, Death Must Die, and 20 Minutes Till Dawn. There's even Halls of Torment right now. These are all examples of Vampire Survivor-like games that do their own thing. Now, the inspiration that they got from Vampire Survivors is massive, don't get me wrong. It's very obvious, very massive, and Vampire Survivors itself was responsible for the genre that they belong to. But I think that a lot of these games do enough that I think that the arena roguelike genre isn't just a pool of Vampire Survivor clones. I think that it's actually already a roguelite subgenre. To illustrate this, let's see these arena roguelike games one by one, or at least the ones that I have played enough to have an opinion on. Compared to Vampire Survivors, Brotato is more of a character-centric game. As you can see here, there are so many characters to choose from. And the thing is, the character that you choose actually matters, unlike in Vampire Survivors. In Vampire Survivors, no matter the character you choose in the game, you will have the same build, or you at least can have the same build for all of them. And it will most likely work. Scratch that, it will work, as long as it's a good enough build. Now, some characters might have higher or lower stats compared to other characters, and some characters might have an advantage over others with specific builds. For example, some characters have larger arenas or areas of effect. Some characters have more of an advantage when it comes to having more projectiles coming out of them. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter. You can have this hidden, overpowered character have the same build as the very first character you get in the game, and they would perform the same if you just give them a good enough build. In Brotato though, it's a lot different. The character that you select at the very beginning will tell you what build you should focus on in the run, or else you will just straight up die at the very beginning. For example, if you try to have a melee character have a gun build, you will do no damage and just end up dying early. Trust me, I've tried and you can see it in the screen right now. And the difference doesn't end there. I haven't even talked about the wave system that it actually introduces into this game. In Vampire Survivors, it's one 30-minute game where hordes will try to get you, and they will get harder as time goes on. In Brotato, it's a game that has you surviving 20 waves of enemies, each wave lasting for 25 seconds, and each wave gets harder and harder as you get to the 20th wave. In between those waves is where you can buy your weapons and passive upgrades for, your character. So you can already see a lot of differences with this game and Vampire Survivors. Even looking at the game, you can already see that even the art style is different. The feel is different as well, and even the arena is different because it's a lot smaller than the open, infinite, procedurally generated world of Vampire Survivors. Next one is 20 Minutes Till Dawn. And this game is one of the first games that popped out after Vampire Survivors came out. And you'd think that it's just going to be a carbon copy of the game because of that. And I will tell you that it has a different formula to it. For one, it's actually difficult. Vampire Survivors has never been known for its difficulty because it is a very easy game once you have enough game knowledge. But in 20 Minutes Till Dawn, it's difficult. And that's probably because you actually have a lot more input into the game. Unlike in Vampire Survivors, wherein all of your focus is all around the game knowledge, getting items, and dodging enemies, in 20 Minutes Till Dawn, you actually have to aim and time your shots. And bear in mind, target priority is not the only thing that you have to think of. It's also target priority depending on your build. Because builds also matter a lot in this game. In Vampire Survivors, I think the only time you can get a very bad build is when you don't get to evolve your weapons properly. In 20 Minutes Till Dawn, increasing your magazine size can screw you over harder than you can even imagine. Because in this game, you can decide a character and their weapon of choice. And the things that you upgrade throughout the run is your abilities and weapon augmentations. So, suffice it to say, there's a lot of customization in this game. For example, there's a character that summons a black hole whenever you reload. So you should probably pair her up with a weapon with a shared magazine size like a crossbow that only has one bullet per reload. So when you use this combination together, you can essentially summon a black hole each shot you make in the game. This essentially makes it so that you have a very smooth sailing from there on. Until you accidentally add more ammo to your mag and screwing your build up, ending up in your death. Now, unlike Brotato, this looks more similar to the Vampire Survivors style art-wise. They're both 2D art styles and, you know, the horde-based stuff. But again, as I've said earlier, 2D art styles weren't really created by Vampire Survivors. It's just a style. So it's just because it kind of looks the same doesn't mean it copied it. The next one we're going to be talking about is probably my favorite arena roguelike game, Death Must Die. It's like Vampire Survivors meets Hades and Diablo, because the way that you get upgrades in this game is like the boon system of Hades, where you borrow the power of the gods to, you know, kill death. And it also has Diablo's gear-like system, wherein your gear actually matters in your game's progression. The better your gear is, the more your stats actually increase. The boss fights in this game is also really fun, I swear. The game gives you the ability to dodge attacks, making bosses have more attack patterns, making boss fights, you know, more fun. If you're gonna take anything away from this video, I would say that just give this game a shot. It's very cheap on Steam, and you know, the developers are actually really active into updating this game and communicating with players. So yeah, I really hope you'd give this game a shot if you haven't yet. And now the final arena type roguelike game that I will mention here is one of the most different out of them all. Maniac is a very recent release, but I would say that it's probably the most interesting when it comes to where it's trying to take the subgenre. You see, like Vampire Survivors, it's a game where you roam around, get upgrades, kill enemies, and try to survive for 30 minutes or 20 minutes if you're still starting out. But in this game, it has a pre-made map, vehicles, and a weird upgrade system. The pre-made map has always been a personal wish for mine when Vampire Survivors was still in early access. I know that the DLCs now are making that happen. It's still kind of a shame that the very beginning levels are very bland, in my opinion. It's just eh. It's a map that you have to roam around in. So yeah, I just think that pre-made maps adds a lot to this genre, where monotony is always an issue that, you know, you have to face. Because of how procedurally generated works on these types of games happen, all the environments will look the same from minute 1 to minute 30. It's going to look so monotonous. So most of the time, it's not really worth mentioning when you're talking about Vampire Survivors, really. So to me, a pre-made map already adds a lot to the game. But what else does it add? Well, the thing is, the way you get upgrades is also very interesting. In Vampire Survivor-like games, exploration has always been an issue. There is not much stopping you from turtling up in one spot for 30 minutes and just, you know, prolonging the whole game. Because you can get upgrades in that one spot and kill the amount of enemies in that one spot and nothing will change. The monotonous environments doesn't really help either. Now, in Vampire Survivors, it tries to change it up a bit by adding different upgrades around the map to incentivize players to just explore. But most of the time, those upgrades aren't really the items that you need for your build, or sometimes they're just too far, and, you know, turtling up is just a more efficient way most of the time, because it also allows you to get a lot more gems than you would usually do. Death Must Die also adds something to the table by giving you permanent and temporary buffs throughout the map if you access these statues and these, you know, small bits and pieces around the map. But I would argue that a lot of these minor stat increases sometimes aren't really worth you losing a lot of upgrades. So Maniac kind of fixes this. Maniac does something completely different from any Vampire Survivor-like game I've seen. Maniac forces you to explore by making it so the upgrades are the ones you look for. You no longer get upgrades from killing monsters or eliminating all of these units. You now have to look for a dealer by locating him somewhere around the map. and that actually adds a lot to the game. Like, not only is the dealer your only source of upgrades, the dealer can also be your lifeline when it comes to near-death experiences, because the dealer can also give you health. So there are always these tense moments where you're thinking if you'll even make it to the dealer on time before dying. And the thing is, the dealer can be very near you, like 20 meters away, 100 meters away, but sometimes it can be 600, 800 meters away from you, and it's so tense when alien ships are trying to chase you and trying to kill you. And I think that's pretty interesting. Sadly, though, I cannot recommend this game yet. Unlike Brotato, Vampire Survivors, and 20 Minutes Till Dawn that started as early access and now all reached 1.0 and are now full releases, Maniac is not an early access game, but it also doesn't feel like it's a full game yet. Because it's not in early access, it's basically advertising itself as an already complete game from the get-go. But I really don't think it's there yet. I think it still needs a lot of polishing. It still lacks a lot of content to be called a full game yet. Like, Death Must Die feels more complete than this, and that's still in early access. So yeah, I don't think I can recommend Maniac yet, but keep an eye on it in the near future because I still think that it's really fun. Not only is it really fun, but I think there's a lot of potential here. From these games alone, I think you can already see that the title of Vampire Survivor Clones doesn't really suit these games. They took the base of the Vampire Survivors game and gave it their own twist. And while there will always be the ones that, skip the twist and just yoink the concept, making it a soulless cash grab, an actual clone, I think that the arena roguelike genre is here to stay and it will probably evolve. Like, what we're seeing with Maniac right now. But yeah, roguelikes are just built different, man. Even games that aren't roguelikes at all, like Honkai Star Rail and Thronefall, have roguelike modes. Because, it's just how much fun the genre is. I really don't know how to end this video, so just buy, subscribe, and do whatever you want.